So I'd like to start the day again by welcoming you and also welcoming Robert Bulman. Robert's going to be our first speaker today. So let's get on with the day. Robert's here today to talk to us about the history of Bulman Island. He's a fourth generation summer camper, and he's fortunate enough to have spent his entire life here, most summers, and now he's chosen to make it his home. So the lake continued to lure him over time, and he and his wife Susan have called Kenora home since their retirement and relocation here 2 years ago. They've been a welcome addition to the community, eagerly diving in where and when they are requested. Today, we welcome him to our stage, so let's give Robert a big hometown welcome.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning to everybody. I never thought I'd be standing up here and talking about the family island, but it's a really good opportunity. I think the whole process started last year when the Lake of the Woods Stewardship Association, formerly known as the Lake of the Woods District Property Owners Association, wrote a story. Susan McLeod wrote a story on Bulman Island, which made us have to do all the research to figure out what the history of this place was. So it gave us a really good starting point, and we've continued to build this history with the members of the family who are still with us, and so I can share that with you today. So the story of Bulman Island dates back to my great-grandparents, and those were William and Lillian Bulman. And my great-grandfather was born in Toronto on April 3rd, 1870, and married Lillian Thompson in 1889. They had 5 children, and that actually influenced how the family cottage expansion was developed. In 1892, the family moved to Winnipeg, where he established Bulman Brothers Lithographers, which is a printing company, with his brother Thomas. My great-grandfather was a very progressive individual for the time and was involved in the Manitoba business and community scene, and was president of the Winnipeg Industrial Bureau and one of the founders of the Winnipeg Art Gallery. Now, the family's first connection to the Lake of the Woods was not what you'd expect, and it had nothing to do with the family camp or the Lake of the Woods natural environment. It all started as a result of the Great Winnipeg Fire in 1904. By that time, the company had grown and had relocated into a brand new building on Bannatyne Avenue West in Winnipeg, and installed a cutting-edge electric elevator. On a mild October night in downtown Winnipeg, in the Bulman 7-story building, remember 7-story building, it was a tower, it was called a tower, a spark arced through the elevator motor and ignited barrels of ink and stacks of paper. The fire department raced to the scene on their horse-drawn fire trucks, but the water pressure was too low due to low reservoirs, and the fire spread to nearby buildings, including the Ashdown warehouse. In the Winnipeg Free Press the following day, they wrote, and I quote, "Of last night's fire, there is at this moment one thing to be said. It brings home to all the urgent necessity of adjusting our firefighting facilities to the needs of the new city, brought about by the erection of high buildings." End of quote. And that was the event that resulted in the construction of the Shoal Lake Aqueduct in 1919. So I guess I can say that our relationship to the Winnipeg, to Lake of the Woods watershed started with a fire in downtown Winnipeg. In 1911, my great-grandparents purchased what is now Bulman Island for $3,000 from a realtor by the name of William Henry Cross, who also owned a few other islands in the area, including Cross Island just north of us. And that's where Bulman Island is, south of Keewatin, south of Mackey's. And here's an aerial shot of it. So as my family lore tells it, my great-grandmother, Lillian Thompson Bulman, chose a 7-acre island because of all the daisies. At the time, there were 2 cottages in the island, both of which were used as sleeping quarters for a mill in the area. These original cottages, with some extensive renovations and additions, still stand today. And the long docks were originally built for the company tugboats that were being used on the lake. Now the family called the island Come Idle Some. Come Idle Some. And this name was painted on the rock leading up from the big dock to the big camp. Now that may have been an appropriate name when there was help to maintain the island, but for the past 40 years, I think the name should have been changed to Come Work a Lot. So, as you can see, this is the big camp when we were painting it. This is our daughter painting it. This was the condition of our big boathouse. And my wife, Susan, whose birthday is today, by the way, and I ripped apart that part, and then we brought in a company to rebuild that side of the dock. So, the original camp, and this is a photo that goes back to about 1911, 1912, was immediately added on to. And while this is going on, the siblings camped in tents, and I understand that that's where the term camp comes from. The second floor was expanded to include a total of 7 bedrooms, 1 for each of my 4 aunts, 1 for a female staff person, and 2 bedrooms for my great-grandparents with an adjoining 3-piece bathroom. On the right side of the screen is the corner bedroom in 2018, and that was the corner bedroom in the 2020s. So an 8th bedroom was on the main level, which was the original room, and we think it dates back to about 1896. And that was used as a guest bedroom. My grandfather stayed in the bunkhouse and the male staff in the upper level of the pump house. Now you probably noticed that my family was not very creative in the selection of names for the various buildings. The big camp, the pump house, the bunkhouse, the big boathouse, not to mention the summer house and the little boathouse. But the names are functional, and we still use those names today. So if you come to the island, that's how we refer to all the places that are there. But getting back to the big camp. The kitchen had a wood stove that was not only used for cooking, but for heating the hot water for the upstairs tub. The kitchen refrigerator was large with 2 wooden doors and ice cooled, and it took 2-foot by 2-foot ice slabs that were attached to pulleys from over the water tank and inserted into the refrigerator from an outside entrance. The ice house rested between the 2 properties and was taken down in 1958 when power came to the island. Each winter, ice slabs were cut from the ice, covering the lake, and placed in the ice house. The kitchen also included a breakfast nook that was used for informal meals for the staff and for the staff to use. There was a formal dining room just outside the kitchen that could seat up to 12, with a separate table that could seat another 4. And I remember growing up, and my grandmother would ring this little brass bell, and that would be the cue for staff to clear the table or bring the next course out. That has not happened in a long time. Just off the dining room was an expansive living room, and that's where all the action took place in the summertime. And it had a large stone fireplace, and these shots were just taken last summer, so as you can see, this is what it looks like today. And this is where we played the card games and the board games and the conversation. And that's where we spent a lot of time today. So at the main dock, there were bath change rooms located behind the boathouse, plus floating docks for swimming. And you can see in this shot the comparison between the boathouse in 1940 and the boathouse in 2018. Well, we've had to replace a lot of the parts. The basic structure has continued to remain. So it doesn't look that much different. As you can see, this is the north face. The roof line has changed a little bit, but it's still basically the same. And the inside is just a classic boathouse. And you can see the boat on the left side, or on the far side of the screen, that's a 22-foot boat with about an 8-foot beam. You can see the slip and the lines coming out the front. That slip actually accommodated a 37-foot boat with a 7-foot beam. So it's a very, very long slip, but with the boats today, we can't go any bigger than that because we can't fit it in there. There was also what we call the summer house, a large screened-in summer house that was overlooking the lake, because the camp, and that seemed to be the custom of the day, was built inside the island, so it didn't really look over the lake. So the summer house is really what you looked over the lake. And in the inset photo, that was the original summer house. But in a big wind, it actually was blown right off the rock one year, and it disappeared. So a smaller, more stable summer house was built with steel posts. At the time, there's also a large vegetable garden, and there was lots of paths around the island. And this is the interior of the summer house, which we renovated about 3 years ago. There's also a fountain outside the dining room of the big camp, and it was built by my great-aunts under the watchful eye of my great-grandfather. And this is 70 to 80 years ago, and as you can see, that fountain is still operational today. There's also a tennis court and a tennis house and grass court that was built in the orchard. And this tennis court was later turned into a croquet lawn, and in the late 1940s, the tennis house came down. I should note that my great-grandfather, loved fishing, and most weekends he would take the train down from Winnipeg and spend the weekend fishing. He was such an avid fisherman that when he felt that fish stocks in the lake were starting to go down or he was having a difficult time to catch them, what he did is he actually loaded up a rail car of fingerlings in Winnipeg. I don't know if they were bass or walleye or what they were, but they were supposed to be delivered to the lake and released. Unfortunately, someone stole the rail car and stocked another lake in northwestern Ontario. So if we were able to track that, I'm sure some of you have caught some of those fingerlings or their descendants in other parts of the lake. So this is a shot that shows you how the island looked in 1913 and how it looks today. And as you can see, there's a lot of similarities. And it's amazing what we've been able to actually preserve in 100 years. Now, it's not by choice necessarily. When the original camp and the boathouse was built, that's when a 2x4 or 2x6 was really a 2x4 and a 2x6. So if you're trying to replace boards now with dimensional lumber, which is not 2x4 anymore, it's 2x3.5, you've got a real problem. So we've tried to preserve as much as we can with the original timber, which is old enough that it's starting to turn into rock anyway, so it's not going to go anywhere. So while this place doesn't really have the amenities of a modern-day cottage, such as insulation, modern plumbing, double or triple glazed windows, I don't think the new places in the lake can match our place for the ambience and the history. At the beginning of the talk, I referenced 2 camps, and the second camp was located north of the big camp and also had been used by the lumber company. Originally, the island was all one title, but even with the kids and the staff around, my great-grandmother was not comfortable being on the island, and so she carved off 2.5 to 3 acres of the island and sold it to, we believe, a Mr. and Mrs. Hug. I don't have confirmation of that, but that seems to be a name that's out there. And this portion had also included the second camp. And the Huggs provided the company she needed until it was repurchased by the family in 1924. When it was repurchased, the living room was enlarged, plus a downstairs bedroom was added, along with a screened-in porch. Stairs were placed a pull-down ladder to access the second floor and 2 bedrooms. There was also an outhouse that is still standing north of the camp and is a real hike to get to, especially if it was cold and raining. The camp was used by my grandfather and his family, as well as my great-aunts and their families until 1938, when my grandfather purchased the big camp for my great-grandfather. One of my great-aunts, Eileen Bulman, married Dr. Cliff Abbott, and after the Second World War, they purchased McMillan Island, which is now called Abbott Island, just west of Bulman Island, leaving 2 of my great-aunts, Bessie and Dorothy, to use the camp until they passed away. And in 1971, my aunt Nancy, my father's sister, and her husband Tony Stevens purchased the camp, and it remains in their family today. So in 1938, my great-grandfather passed away, and my grandfather purchased the main camp. and the next generation, including my father and my two aunts, came onto the scene. My grandfather built cement piers to stop erosion, built the small boathouse that housed the smaller watercraft, and was situated beside a beach where the kids and grandkids played, and they still play today. Now, I've talked about my great-grandfather, just a bit on my grandfather. He was a graduate of Royal Military College in Kingston, and this influenced dinnertime conversation and conduct. If things got too loud, you would hear his voice saying very authoritatively, "Quai." He wouldn't even say quiet, it would be quai. Unlike my great-grandfather, who insisted all of my great-aunts attend and graduate from university, maintain the boats, fix the engine, build the fountain that existed today, and participate in dinnertime conversations. And this is going back to the 20s, 30s, and 40s. My grandfather was more paternal, and conversations around the dinner table were conducted primarily with the males. And my aunt says that she was quiet at the dinner table, as the men could discuss things. So in addition to the small boathouse, the upper level of the pump house was renovated to accommodate married staff when they were working the island. And Mr. Thorpe was my grandfather's builder, and I remember he seemed to be around all the time building or repairing one thing or another. I only remember one full-time staff couple, as that age of staff was quickly disappearing. And I think I was about 10 years old when the last couple were hired. In the 1950s, my father and mother built their own camp in the south end of the island, which is where I grew up along with my two brothers, and then they acquired the big camp when my grandfather passed away in 1969. And that's the same year that Tony and Nancy bought Bessie and Dorothy's camp. The next transition was when one of my brothers purchased the small camp, and my wife and I purchased the big camp in 2015 from my parents, who are both still alive at the ages of 90 and 93, but can no longer enjoy the lake and live full-time in Winnipeg. So that gives you a bit of the history surrounding the camps, but remember, these camps are on an island, so this history would not be complete without talking a little bit about the boats. So 2 second-hand boats were purchased around 1911. The Gita, with a registration number, and I believe this is true, of 13. That's it, 13. It was a classic wooden boat that was 27 feet long with a large open bow for seating. Its gray engine was able to move the boat around 7 miles per hour, so a trip to Keewatin was quite a journey. And if it was inclement, they would put up this top, and it had metal hoops with a canvas over top. Just think of a chuck wagon. It looked just like that. My aunts were so embarrassed to be seen in that boat that if they went by a place where they had friends, they would hide so they couldn't be seen. All the fittings are brass, and I remember when I was younger, lemon oiling the wood each morning. That was my job. When I was 15, I came down to the dock early in the spring, and the Gita wasn't there anymore. My grandfather was worried that it was beginning to leak and was unsafe. So that previous winter, it was dragged onto the ice and burned. If only I had been a few years older or had consulted the rest of the family in this decision, I would have loved to have salvaged this very classic boat. And I'm sure I saw a sister boat in Sports Illustrated about 10 years ago, and I said, that's the Gita. So it's something I really miss still. The other boat was the Meander. So this is the one that stayed in the large slip in the big boathouse. It was purchased around 1912 or 1913. And it was 36 feet long, and it had a very narrow beam constructed from cypress. It was so narrow, as I mentioned earlier, 7 feet, that it didn't take the waves well, and a ballast of steel bricks were placed in the hull to provide more stability. The Meander was given to Camp Stevens in the 1960s to be used as a camp boat, but was not really designed for that, and then passed through a number of owners. And while it's been stripped down of all the brass, the hull is in dry dock on the lake, somewhere. In addition to these boats, there was also wooden canoes, a rowboat, and a punt used for hauling wood and rocks from as far away as Whiskey Island. There was also a racing boat, a Peterborough, with a 32 horsepower motor. It was a racing boat. My Aunt Bessie also kept chickens on one of the small islands, a pursuit that we're planning on continuing this summer. In the 1950s and 60s, if you remember, DDT was used to control pests, but it was doing serious damage to the insect and bird populations, including the eagles. And my grandfather was a true naturalist and refused to spray any chemicals in the island, and had some beautiful flower and vegetable gardens, which my wife has not only maintained but expanded. I think that has stood us in good stead, as our mosquito population is totally controlled by dragonflies, and we have an abundance of wildlife, from garter snakes to birds to otters, bear and deer. So as you can see, this is the camps in 1911. The main floor basically was the same. It was the second floor that was added onto, and that was the big difference between the camps. I just have to get this going. There we go. So Lake of the Woods has always been an important part of our family for what is now going on its 6th generation. For those of you who've gone through succession issues with cottages, you know how difficult this process can be. I believe that what's driven us is to continue this legacy is the fact that we cannot comprehend what our lives would be without Lake of the Woods. Our family's history is woven into the fabric of the lake, growing up and learning how to swim, fishing with our favorite uncles, marriages, celebrating birthdays, getting marooned down the lake when the engine stops running, canoe trips, learning how to sail. Well, technology now brings us not only power and water, but cell phones and internet access. For us, it's the one place that we can all enjoy and are excited about moving into the 7th generation. Into the 6th generation, I'm sorry. So as you can see, this is our daughter, who's the 5th generation, and our brand new grandchild, Millie, who is the 6th generation. The little guy in the middle is me, with my grandfather and my father. So thank you very much.